Everyone has a Primarch tier list. Horus at number 1 because he's the Warmaster and nobody moves him without an argument. Sanguinius near or at the top because he wounded Horus and died in a way the lore clearly wants you to feel as irreplaceable loss. Angron somewhere near the summit in any category involving direct violence, because by community consensus, he represents the physical ceiling of what a Primarch body can produce. And Perturabo, if he appears at all, gets filed 5th to 8th on a good day, tagged as siege specialist, logistics genius, the architect of attrition rather than the figure you want in a one-on-one fight. Brilliant, cold, not the one who wins Primarch fistfights. The Daka combat ranking, pulling from narrative sources, goes Horus first, Angron second, Sanguinius third, then Kurz, Russ, Fulgrim, Corax, the lion appearing somewhere in the top 8. Reddit's r/40k lore assembled a similar hierarchy. Angron, Russ, Sanguinius, and Horus holding the top tier. Perturabo absent from even the second bracket. A fanverse list goes Sanguinius, Horus, Angron, Lion, Magnus, Russ, Khan, Fulgrim. Perturabo does not appear in the top 8. A Quora breakdown places him at lower mid, several positions below Fulgrim and Corvus Corax. Across dozens of independent rankings, the consensus is consistent enough to qualify as a consensus. Perturabo doesn't crack the top combat bracket. That consensus is built on assumptions that fall apart the moment you test them against named feats in named sources. The community has been running a reputation-based ranking system for years, and the receipts disagree. Before the centerpiece exhibit, a framework the community already intuitively uses but rarely articulates precisely. The distinction between Primarchs as mortal warriors during the Horus heresy and Primarchs as demon princes, with all the warp amplification that Ascension confers. 6 of the original 20 made the crossing. Magnus was first. Tzeentch claimed him in the immediate aftermath of the Battle of Prospero, the Thousand Suns homeworld raised by the Space Wolves as the opening act of a war that Magnus had tried to prevent. Fulgrim followed during the events documented in Angel Exterminatus by Graham McNeil, ascending on the crone world of Idris during a ritual that used Perturabo's own life force as fuel. Angron's transformation came at the purging of Nuceria, engineered by Lorgar during the Shadow Crusade, mid-heresy. Mortarion crossed during the late heresy. Lorgar's ascension timing is disputed across sources. Perturabo became a demon prince after the heresy concluded, specifically after the Iron Cage incident, sacrificing captured Imperial Fist's gene seed to the Chaos Gods. Demon ascension confers specific things the lore catalogs consistently. Warp regeneration, physical amplification across every attribute, immortality of a particular and terrifying kind, the capacity to interact with the immaterium in ways a mortal Primarch can't access. The older community understanding treated this as a categorical separator. A mortal Primarch fighting a demon Primarch is a category mismatch. Fulgrim's subsequent demolition of Guilliman at the Battle of Thessala was the community's standard exhibit for what that gap looks like in practice. A fully developed demon prince against a mortal loyalist, and it isn't close. The Siege of Terra novel series then actively complicated this framework. The books showed loyalist Primarchs holding their own in ways the older binary couldn't accommodate. The line between categories isn't as absolute as the community preferred. That complication matters because the argument here isn't that any sufficiently motivated mortal Primarch can defeat any ascended one. The argument is that one specific Primarch defeated a fully ascended demon Primarch of Khorne in documented, sourced combat, and the community's tier lists have been organized as though that fight never happened. First, the target to dismantle. Pull up any community ranking and the justifications are recognizable. Horus at the top because he killed Sanguinius and nearly killed the Emperor, which conflates narrative significance with combat evidence. Horus being the central antagonist means the story requires him to feel invincible, and that narrative requirement gets read backward into tier lists as though it were documented martial performance. One thread on Reddit's r/40k lore posed the question directly. Horus has virtually zero impressive feats of combat, so where does his #1 status actually come from? The community didn't produce a clean answer because the answer is the title and the plot structure, not the fight record. Angron's S-tier placement in combat rankings is closer to defensible, but still relies on the berserker image doing reasoning that the actual record should be doing. The Lion's top 5 placement is almost entirely a product of faction loyalty and the intuition that the First Legion's Primarch should rank highly. Perturabo's absence from the top bracket is the most instructive data point. The community has so thoroughly collapsed his identity into siegecraft and engineering that his direct combat feats get filtered out before they reach the tier list conversation entirely. The lore has a different answer. It's in Slaves to Darkness, written by John French, and it happened on a planet called Deluge. The context is worth establishing because the absurdity of the mission statement is itself the story's opening condition. Mid-heresy, Horus is preparing the final push toward Terra. The traitor coalition needs to be assembled, coordinated, and moving with strategic coherence. The problem is Angron, fully ascended demon Primarch of Khorne by this point, rampaging across the galaxy on an undirected, blood-soaked detour with his World Eaters and a trailing host of Khornate demons. Ignoring the muster at Ulanor, ignoring strategic reality, following the Blood God's imperative, because there is no longer a meaningful part of Angron capable of choosing otherwise. He isn't a general anymore. He is a weapon that has stopped pointing at the right targets. Horus dispatches 2 brothers simultaneously. Lorgar goes to retrieve Fulgrim. Perturabo goes to retrieve Angron. The symmetry of that assignment is its own comment on the heresy's logistics at this stage. The Warmaster of the most powerful military force in galactic history is running Primarch retrieval operations because 2 of his demon brothers have become too autonomous to coordinate without personal intervention by their peers. Perturabo arrives on Deluge to find a planet the World Eaters have already processed. The population has been massacred and the corpses stacked into mountains. The specific description in the Lexicanum's Angron entry, not interpretive metaphor. The Iron Warriors fight through crazed World Eaters and the Khornate demonic forces still prowling the aftermath. Then the sky opens up and Angron himself enters the carnage. The Lexicanum documents what follows with the precision the community should have been citing for years. Perturabo and Angron engaged in a brutal battle, with the demon having the clear edge in power and speed. Read the specific language. The canonical source for this fight explicitly states that Angron was physically superior, faster, more powerful. A fully ascended Daemon Primarch of Khorne, carrying all the warp amplification that crossing into demonhood provides. The fight does not begin as an even contest. The demon has the clear edge. That is the opening condition. What Perturabo does with that disadvantage is change the nature of the engagement entirely. He doesn't attempt to match Angron blow for blow on terms that favor a being built entirely for maximum physical violence. He takes wounds. The Lexicanum records this explicitly, that he endured despite taking many wounds, but keeps operating while under direct assault. Simultaneously, he deploys the Iron Circle, 6 Domitar Ferrum class battle automata, personally designed by Perturabo, telepathically linked to him, tireless in a way Space Marines can't be, capable of performing complex tactical maneuvers without the hesitation of biological self-preservation instinct. He coordinates the Iron Warriors around him. He uses Volk, the newly created Obliterator, a warrior who had just undergone the Obliterator transformation on Serum and was now something neither fully Space Marine nor machine, to provide additional tactical pressure at specific points. The World Eaters surrounding Angron are bombarded, outmaneuvered, stripped away from the Demon Primarch, who had been operating with a full supporting force between himself and anything requiring patience or adjustment. Perturabo does this while being hit. The wounds accumulate. He keeps operating. The psychological dimension runs simultaneously with the military one. He goads Angron. The specific words recorded in the lore, that Angron was born a slave and was now a slave to darkness for all eternity, are targeted with surgical precision at a specific wound that predates the gladiatorial pits of Nuceria, that predates the butcher's nails themselves. Against a being defined by rage, against a Primarch whose neural implants have spent decades destroying the architecture for restraint or strategic recalculation. Perturabo deploys language as a combat multiplier. He finds the wound of what was done to Angron, the fundamental insult of the enslavement, the surgery, the Emperor's teleportation, the destruction of everything Angron had built on Fed Moor, and applies pressure to it precisely when Angron can't process the pressure in any way except escalating rage that Perturabo has already structured the field to contain. The Lexicanum's verdict: Angron was bested. The Ultramarines' fleet then appeared in orbit over Deluge. Angron laughed and told Perturabo they were all going to die. Perturabo's response was to remind the demon Primarch that he had watched his warriors slaughtered while doing nothing once before. A direct reference to Nuceria, to the moment the Emperor teleported Angron off Fed Moor against his will, and Angron watched his gladiator brothers and sisters annihilated from orbit, while surrounded by custodians with spears pointed at him. The calculation was precise. Perturabo understood that the single stimulus capable of moving Angron past his own rage and towards something resembling purposeful action was the specific memory of his Nucerian comrades dying without him there. It worked. Angron created a warp storm. Both the Iron Warriors and World Eater's fleets escaped the Ultramarines and continued to Ulanor, where they accompanied Horus for the final muster. Perturabo didn't just defeat Demon Angron. He then leveraged him into executing the next strategic objective. 2 source accuracy notes any serious engagement with this exhibit requires. The Soul Drain. Fulgrim using the Mogatar stone on Idris to extract Perturabo's life force as ritual fuel for his demon ascension is documented in Angel Exterminatus by Graham McNeil, a separate novel set at an earlier point in the heresy. The Angron fight is in Slaves to Darkness by John French, set later. These are distinct events in distinct books. The Soul Drain is confirmed in multiple sources as involving a specific named artifact on a specific named world, and Perturabo then striking Fulgrim with his Thunderhammer immediately after a loyalist Astartes shattered the Mogatar stone, partially restoring his stolen energy. That is a secondary feat, mortal Perturabo operating on a depleted life force, striking a freshly ascended demon prince of Slaanesh. Then, later in the heresy, the same Primarch bested a fully developed and long-established demon Primarch of Khorne at Deluge. 2 books, 2 demon Primarchs, 1 Primarch on the other side of both encounters. The nuance that prevents overclaiming. After the heresy, as a demon prince himself, Perturabo fought Demon Mortarion on the planet Dactus for 7 hours. He caused terrible damage to the Death Guard force before being forced to concede defeat. That is a loss. He isn't an invincible demon slayer. He fought 1 demon Primarch for 7 hours and lost that specific engagement. He defeated a different demon Primarch while still mortal. The record is complicated in exactly the way honest records usually are. The community placing him outside the top combat tier reflects a fundamental category error, mistaking specialization framing for performance data. The Siegecraft Association has become so dominant in how the community processes Perturabo that his direct combat outcomes get filtered out before they reach the ranking conversation. Now, Angron himself, because the community's read of him is one of the most instructive examples of the right answer produced through entirely wrong reasoning. S tier in combat. The most feared melee threat in the galaxy by most accounts. Daemon Primarch of Khorne. The Berserker God. That placement is probably correct in outcome. The reasoning attached to it's almost entirely wrong about the mechanism. The Lexicanum's entry on the butcher's nails opens with specific words that should anchor this entire discussion, bearing resemblance to a lobotomy, not metaphorically. Large amounts of nails, trailed with cables, were inserted through the skull and into the brain. The technology was developed by the ruling aristocracy of Nuceria, specifically for their gladiatorial slaves, not to enhance a warrior holistically, but to amplify aggression for arena entertainment while stripping the gladiator of everything else. Angron received them as punishment for loyalty. He and the older gladiator, Inomaus, had fought together for years in the pits of Deshay. Inomaus was mentor, father figure, the closest approximation of family available in a world built around watching people kill each other. The two of them had scored major victories together, including killing a pair of berserk ogrins in the arena. After that victory, the High Riders demanded the two fight each other to the death. Angron refused. The explicit act of defiance, choosing loyalty to Inomaus over self-preservation, choosing a person over survival, was met with the ruling aristocracy ordering the butcher's nails hammered into his skull. He was loosed on Inomaus while still in the post-surgery frenzy. When he came back to himself, he had killed the man he had refused to kill. He howled for days. The neurological consequences were examined twice and sealed from the imperial record both times. When the emperor retrieved Angron from Nuceria and brought him aboard the Warhound's flagship, the archmagos Vel Caradar examined the implants over 7 hours under Malcador the Sigillite's personal supervision. The findings were reported to the emperor, who ordered them classified under his personal seal, the Palatine Aquila. Vel Caradar had found that the nails had remapped Angron's brain after implantation, reducing serotonin production to enforce instinctive aggression, deadening emotional responses, rewriting the electrical activity of every brain region except the one regulating adrenaline. The technology had not been designed for a Primarch's neurological complexity. It was eroding his mental stability and progressively damaging his capacity to reason. It would eventually kill him, the precise timeline unknown, but the outcome certain. Later, during the heresy, Arcan Land was brought to a secret laboratory inside a dormant volcano on Terra. Land had encountered related technology before, in the Hexarchian vaults, where he had ordered the vaults sealed due to the threat the devices presented to the machine cult. He told the Emperor the implants were called a crucimin in the older records, but the versions he had seen were more primitive. The Emperor confirmed that the nails had replaced part of Angron's brain. Specifically, Angron was missing his limbic lobe and his insular cortex, two named neurological structures. The nails occupied the space those structures had occupied. This is why removing them would kill him. Not because the surgery was irreversible in a general technical sense, but because the nails had become structural components in a brain they had already partially consumed. The limbic lobe and insular cortex are the structures primarily responsible for emotional regulation, empathy, self-awareness, and the processing of social connection and meaning. Their removal wasn't a side effect of the butcher's nails. It was their function. Nuceria's aristocracy wanted a gladiator who felt pleasure only in violence. They produced one. But between the installation of the nails and the heresy, Angron led a slave revolt that held off 7 well-equipped Nucerian armies in the northern mountains, an extended campaign requiring tactical coherence, supply management across thousands of gladiators, and the kind of sustained leadership that the community's dumb muscle framing can't accommodate. He fed his comrades his own blood when they were starving. He chose terrain. He managed morale in conditions designed to destroy it. The nails had taken from him. They had not yet finished consuming what remained. Whatever existed before the surgery was still operating alongside the amplified rage, and Nuceria's armies found out what that combination produces. Lorgar recognized the trajectory. He recommended that Angron return to Nuceria during the Shadow Crusade, ostensibly to find a way to save the Primarch's life, which Angron agreed to attempt. When they arrived, They discovered that the slave lords had massacred Angron's Nucerian comrades years earlier and told the population that Angron had fled their last stand. The purge of Nuceria followed, and the ritual Lorgar had prepared on the surface was never a cure for the nails. It was a substitution. Lorgar channeled Angron's dying rage into a cornate working. The demon ascension at Nuceria was how Angron survived the technology that had been killing him since he was a boy in a pit. He had agreed to let Lorgar try to save his life. He received corn. The community calls this dumb muscle in the S tier. The accurate tier placement coexists with a framing that erases the specific mechanism that produced it. Angron is S tier in combat because of what was surgically removed from him, not in spite of it. His own words to the Emperor during their first conversation, standing on the deck of the flagship, watching his comrades annihilated below, carry a weight the tier list conversation has almost entirely bypassed. He said he was meant to die on that mountain, alongside his brothers and sisters, and that now only a ghost remained. The Emperor replied that a ghost would suffice for what he had planned. A precise summary of the transaction and why Angron burned for it across the entirety of the heresy. Corvus Corax sits in the low tier of most community rankings. The Raven Guard Primarch, master of guerrilla warfare, survivor of the drop site massacre at Istvan V, spent years rebuilding his legion from near extinction. He doesn't fit the metric most tier lists apply, which rewards visible force, massive weapons, and the kind of combat record that makes straightforward storytelling easy. The author most responsible for building the Corax material, Gav Thorpe, has stated in authorial commentary that Corax belongs among the top-tier Primarchs, up there with Horus and Sanguinius. A creator's statement rather than in-text canon, but the person who wrote the character most extensively across the Black Library doesn't place him where the community does. That discrepancy is at minimum worth the acknowledgement. His fight record includes direct weapons engagement with Lorgar in Aaron Dembski-Bowden's The First Heretic, the Raven Guard Primarch with his weapons locked against the Wordbearers, close enough that the text describes Corax crying into his brother's face as the blades held. That is Primarch to Primarch physical engagement against a target most rankings don't place in the bottom tier, held to a standoff. Lorgar disengaged and hurled Corax backward. Not a victory for Corax, but not the record of a Primarch incapable of contesting his peers either. The Horus confrontation requires honest framing. Pre-heresy, during the campaign designated Gate 42, Corax and Horus came to blows, documented phrasing that indicates physical engagement rather than argument, though the specifics of that exchange aren't resolved in the available sources. Gate 42 was a campaign where Horus deployed the Proto-Legion Corax eventually came to lead as expendable garrison and saboteur forces, the kind of utilitarian disposal that created lasting animosity and that Corax later recognized as a preview of what Horus actually thought about the Primarchs he couldn't use for prestige operations. At Istvan V, during the drop site massacre itself, the most comprehensively lopsided ambush of the entire heresy, 3 loyal legions turned against simultaneously in a prepared killing ground. One account places Corax on a direct path toward Horus, heading to remove his heart, close enough that the record specifies he would have reached him but for extraordinary circumstances. Those circumstances were Conrad Kurz. The Night Haunter intercepted Corax, and Corax burned his flight pack's complete fuel reserves to escape Kurz's grip and survive. The specific confirmation that Corax landed a direct blow on Horus isn't in the available sourced material and can't be presented as settled fact. What the evidence supports is a Primarch who arrived at the single worst day of the heresy, in the middle of a prepared massacre with every numerical and strategic advantage held by the traitors, and came within one intercepted path of the Warmaster. A Primarch in the low tier of community combat rankings doesn't almost reach Horus under those conditions. Sanguinius's position near the summit is the community's most defensible call, and the actual evidence for it's stronger than the emotional architecture of his death usually permits people to notice. The traitor Warmaster said it himself. The record preserves Horus's own retrospective assessment, that it should have been Sanguinius, that the Blood Angels Primarch had the vision and strength to carry the rebellion to victory, and the wisdom to rule once victory was won. The arch-traitor endorsing the Loyalist Angel's supremacy without tactical reason to do so is the kind of canonical statement that cuts through faction arguments cleanly. Sanguinius also wounded Horus during their confrontation on the Vengeful Spirit, wounds that left marks the Emperor was able to exploit during the final confrontation. One source in the lore is direct about the qualifier on Horus's victory, that he beat Sanguinius when operating at maximum chaos amplification, with the implication that the calculation changes without that amplification. Rabute Guilliman's assessment in The Unremembered Empire is the most analytically rigorous canonical opinion available on Primarch hierarchy. Guilliman ran 5 expeditionary fleets simultaneously, wrote the Codex Astartes from first principles, and built his entire operational philosophy around systematic evaluation rather than intuition or sentiment. In that novel, Guilliman places only Lion L. Johnson and Horus above himself. He admired Sanguinius beyond that analytical placement, in terms that go beyond tactical assessment. An internal ranking from the Primarch least given to sentimentality or faction loyalty isn't nothing. The Silent King's tribute is the most unexpected piece of evidence in this conversation, and the one furthest outside the frame the community usually argues within. Sarek, last ruler of the ancient Necron-tier Triarch, the being who made the deal with the Catan that transferred his civilization's consciousness into living metal bodies, spent millions of years in self-imposed exile after the biotransference, returning only when Tyranid hive fleets made isolation untenable. He has observed galactic civilizations rise and dissolve across timescales that make the Imperium of Man look like a recent experiment. His perspective on individual beings isn't shaped by narrative weight, by faction loyalty, or by the mythology the Imperium has built around its own primarchs. The Blood Angels Codex documents an event called the Alliance at Devil's Crag. In Necron, Blood Angels Alliance against a shared enemy that traces its roots to a meeting between Zarek and Sanguinius placed before the Horus Heresy, before the 31st millennium. In the novel Dante, the chapter master of the Blood Angels encounters Zarek wearing a mask very similar to the Golden Death Mask of Sanguinius. Zarek explains that he knew Sanguinius. The formal alliance was never sealed. Sanguinius declined it, but the refusal was conducted with enough grace and mutual respect that Zarek honored it in a form that outlasted the Primarch's death by 10 millennia, wearing the face of the man who turned him down as a tribute that persisted through the entirety of the Age of Imperium. An entity with millions of years of galactic experience chose to permanently mark a specific human Primarch in that way. He didn't extend it to the Warmaster. He didn't extend it to Guilliman or Russ or the Lion. Whatever Sarek encountered when he met Sanguinius before the heresy, whatever qualities that meeting revealed to a being who has evaluated civilizations the Imperium has never heard of, they were significant enough to hold for 10,000 years. The community argues about combat rankings from inside the Imperium's own mythology. The Necron Emperor gave his assessment from entirely outside it. The Lion versus Horus debate generates more comment section activity than any other Primarch comparison in this space. And for one precise reason, the lore has been refusing to resolve it, which means both sides can fight without running out of ammunition. The factual baseline is unambiguous. There is no canonical pre-heresy or heresy era direct duel between Lion L. Johnson and Horus Lupercal. No fight scene, no sparring session, no documented exchange. The debate exists because the rivalry existed. The Lion believed himself the superior candidate for Warmaster, resented the appointment going to Horus deeply, and spent the early heresy operating with enough ambiguity that Lorgar received visions suggesting he might side with the traitors. None of that is a fight. All of it generates faction arguments. What the lore does provide is Guilliman's canonical placement of Lion and Horus together above himself in the Unremembered Empire, an unsentimental analytical assessment from the Primarch least likely to be motivated by anything except his own rigorous evaluation. Lion's documented 30,000 combat record adds weight. He fought Leman Russ in a confrontation that lasted a full solar day and night, described as equally matched, with Russ slightly stronger and the Lion slightly quicker, neither able to close the gap across the entire engagement. He defeated Conrad Kurz, snapping the Night Haunter's spine. Kurz occupies the upper bracket in most community combat rankings. The Lion beat him. The 40K record is where the conversation becomes sharpest. In the Arcs of Omen, the Lion rulebook, the returned Primarch fought Daemon Angron in the current era of the setting. The rulebook's account of the opening exchange is direct. Angron unleashed a flurry of blows upon the Lion, forced open a gap in his opponent's guard, and landed a kick to L. Johnson's chest that cracked it. Daemon Angron broke the Lion's chest in the opening exchange of that fight. The Lion absorbed a cracked chest from the Demon Primarch of Khorne and kept fighting. He outmaneuvered Angron's rage through tactical superiority and banished him back to the warp. Two Primarchs have documented feats of defeating Daemon Angron in direct combat. Perturabo, mid-heresy, enslaves to darkness. The Lion, in the current era of 40K, in Arcs of Omen, the Lion. Both won through tactical application rather than raw physical dominance. Both exploited the same structural vulnerability in a being who is extremely powerful and almost incapable of adjusting his approach mid-fight. His predictability, his inability to process anything except the straightforward satisfaction of the rage. That pattern describes a specific kind of combat intelligence that neither Primarch gets credited for in standard tier list conversations. The claim the sourced material actually supports. Lion L. Johnson has a stronger documented combat record against Demon Primarchs than Horus Lupercal has against any Primarch.